Well, hello everyone. This is Zach Brooks from World Transplant Athletes. If you have a body with a new part, you are a World Transplant Athlete. You can follow us at World Transplant Athletes on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, and your social media platform of choice. We have a team of 20 organ transplant recipients from 11 countries in 6 languages in every continent of the world except for Antarctica, working behind the scenes to make content for you. Today, we're doing a podcast called Friends of World Transplant Athletes to celebrate and support groups anywhere and everywhere that are either led by an organ transplant recipient or have recipients as their primary focus. So today, we're so lucky to be talking to Brooke Gurrard, who is a chronic illness coach with a focus on organ transplant recipients and the host of the Bonus Years podcast. You can check her out at brookegurrard.com. Brooke, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, so maybe you can take a few minutes here and tell everyone a little bit about you. Obviously, we know your name, but where you're from, maybe if you've traveled or moved in your life, where you are now, and which transplant did you have?
Well, like you said, everyone knows my name now. I'm Brooke. I currently reside in Olympia, Washington, USA. That's the Great Pacific Northwest. And I was born and raised in South Mississippi. So when my liver failed, I ended up at the transplant center in New Orleans, Auctioner Medical Center, who performed my liver transplant almost 18 years ago.
Wow. What was the underlying cause of the liver failure?
I got a sudden diagnosis of autoimmune hepatitis that turned quickly into acute liver failure over a period of 6 weeks.
Wow. So, the first day, did you remember that first 6-week period? You just felt like some cold, flu-ish kind of symptoms, or what did you experience early on? 6 weeks is fast.
It's very fast. And I was 20 years old. And I don't know if you remember being 20, where you kind of feel invincible, even if bad things are happening to your body or around you. So I went home from college. I had just finished my sophomore year of school. And I think I felt tired, but I attributed it to I just finished finals week. I'd been up all night cramming, the typical like college behavior stuff. And my mom is the one who was like, maybe you should get a checkup. You don't look quite right. And that was kind of the onset of, okay, we think things are okay. We'll do some blood work. And then they said they'd give me a call back within a week. And instead I got a call back the next day saying, come back in. We want to run more tests. So,
wow.
I was totally healthy for 20 years. I couldn't remember being in the hospital. I couldn't remember ever having blood drawn. And then to suddenly be like, okay, you have an autoimmune disorder. It's causing your liver to be inflamed. Eat some popsicles, drink some water, take some rest. Kind of that was the basic prescription at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And my liver just couldn't bounce back. It couldn't regenerate properly.
Then you were whooshed away in the world of transplantation, it sounds like.
Indeed.
So how long was it from that 6-week diagnosis that you got a transplant? Was it 6 weeks only you got a transplant?
So a lot of that 6-week time was figuring out if my liver was going to kind of hit the restart button. In hospital, high dose steroids, kind of all the measures you would take pre-transplant to make sure like we're doing everything we can to see if we can help you. By the time they did a biopsy of my liver, they had to go down this old vein here because my liver had shrunken up so much. It was the size of a fist. And the cell structure within my liver had collapsed to a degree where they couldn't even tell what caused it to fail. They couldn't tell what would make it restart, but they just knew it wasn't going to happen. So I remember the day my transplant team, who they weren't my transplant team yet, they were the transplant team. They came in and they tried to warn me like, hey, we think transplants, you're a good candidate for it. Here's where you're at. And as the 20-year-old that I was in the moment, I said, well, what if I don't want it? Like, I thought I'd be fine.
Mhm.
And one of the doctors looked at me very seriously, and he'd kind of been joking with me up to that point, and he said, "You might live
Mhm.
a week." And I remember going,
Wow.
"Oh, that's serious. I guess I should take this more seriously." So I was listed for a liver transplant June 21st, 2005, and 3 days later I was transplanted.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, you're listening to these stories, you probably do the same. They're all so fascinating. There's some touch points that are similar, but every story is so unique, and people, like, wait years for this, and that's hard for sure, but then they kind of develop a routine, and they're like, "My life was great," and then they suddenly have it,
Mhm.
and yours is so acute, so fast. There's such a shock to the system that it's a very different kind of story. In terms of what you were saying to the doctor, I have a very similar thing. I was actually a little bit older, 28, and I said, "Well, what if I don't go on dialysis?" And the doctor said, "Well, you'll live a week." And at that point, my decision-making process changed, radically, but, it seems normal enough to kind of fight off this really difficult bit of information for as long as possible until you just can't. So it sounds like you had, or I had a similar story to you, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
So you got through that. You're still young, really young, at that moment, and then you've done some really other cool things. So the next question I have for you, but you're gonna have to build in some gaps for the audience, I think here. The next question I have for you is like, what is your organization? And I introduced you as having both a coaching thing and the bonus years, but it seems like from 20 till now, a couple years later, there's some other things that happened. So maybe you can kind of fill in the gaps how you got to forming
Whew.
your work.
You're nice to say it's been a couple of years because it's been almost 18. So I'm turning 38 tomorrow.
Okay. Well,
And
hey, happy birthday.
it I know, Pisces. Pisces unite,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, Pisces
And
unite.
so it's been almost 18 years since the transplant for me. And
Mhm.
immediately, as a young person, I wanted kind of the full range of my life back. I pressed up really hard against that like idea of having a new normal. I wanted my old normal. I was a
Mm.
musician. I was in college studying classical singing. I had to regrow a lot of muscle in my abdomen to be able to do the thing that I had always done very easily. And so I did some advocacy work as a part of what felt to me like the only way I knew how to cope at that point in my life. Like, I want to give back. I want to talk about how this has changed my life and saved my life. Um, but I also had this like maybe young person syndrome, and also maybe just because of the quickness of my illness. Like, I had severe PTSD and trauma that went undiagnosed for a while because
Mhm.
when you are a healthy person and then all of a sudden they tell you you might live a week if you don't do this one thing, um, like there's nothing that really prepares you for that ahead of time. And so I found myself over the past 18 years kind of peeling back layers of, oh, this kind of felt triggering to me. Why did this thing hurt so much? Because
Mhm.
of something that happened during the transplant process, or my body having memories of that same time of year where my body kind of feels off and is aware that like this is when things got stirred up. And so, I did a lot of career things that I really enjoyed. And um, during COVID is when I stopped to pause and go, okay, I'm older now. I have a husband, I have kids, I have kind of a stable life. What do I want to do with the rest of it?
Mm.
And it had been a long time since I'd been actively doing advocacy work. And during that break, I had the realization that I just really like talking to people and helping them, whether it's helping them share their story, whether it's sharing a bit of mine to encourage somebody else. I was like, this is the thing for me. Like, this is the thing that excites me, that wakes me up in the morning and says, like, yes, I want to find community for all these people. So during COVID, home at home, being isolated, I decided I'm going to start blogging and having guest bloggers come on and talk about their health experiences. Um, a lot of it's mental health, a lot of it's things that happened that I wasn't prepared for when I had a transplant. that it would be kind of an ongoing work in our life of like active recovery. And my husband is not a reader. So he suggested to me, how about you take what you're writing about and start a podcast? And that felt completely overwhelming to me because I'm technology
Mm.
savvy, but not in the form of like me producing a show and doing all of that. So he said, we'll do it together. We'll start together. It'll be fun. He's like, that way you'll get people like me who never read anything, but they'll still get your content. I said,
Mm-hmm.
that sounds fun. Why not? We're home. We're home. It's the COVID. Let's try something new.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of how the bonus years started. My family always called every year after my transplant a bonus. And so we celebrate. Sometimes it's bonus days and bonus moments. And sometimes it really is bonus years. And June will mark 18 of these extra years of life that I wasn't guaranteed.
Yeah, so
So
listening to your
that's
story from, go
the
ahead,
journey.
Brooke, finish
No,
up.
you go ahead.
Yeah,
Go
well,
ahead.
so just listening to your story from a distance, like when you started talking about the singer and then the podcast, I was thinking to myself, well, of course it makes sense, but you had to find maybe some way back to that 18 years later. But the other thing that really stood out, Brooke, is how well you had gone back and tracked your emotional state like a year after and so forth, and the reflection you did on that, because it's so insightful. Because I think every recipient, or maybe someone who's gone through cancer, or, something similar, like really hardcore stuff, I imagine they go through that, but I would say very few of them have that deep reflection that they can kind of like work from in order to improve themselves mentally and socially and everything else better. How did you get to that point? Because to me, that stands out as I haven't heard that part of it before. Like 1 year ago, you were going through this experience, and now I'm going through this, going from normal, old normal to new normal. How did you get to that kind of insight? Because that's really special insight you came up with, that, Brooke.
That's a really good question. um, I think I've always been more of a reflective person. Uh, I
Mm-hmm.
I journal, like that's kind of catharsis for me. It's not real until I've written it down or processed it with a friend. And so over time, I look back at journals from when I was sick,
Mm.
expectations that I had put on myself that no one else was putting on me. Like, um, I grew up a very like Christian conservative, like I was at a Christian university when I got sick. And I remember thinking and like going back and finding journals that said things like, you have a responsibility to be an example. Like you need to be grateful. And what I didn't
Mm.
write because I didn't know it yet was it's okay to have hard times in the middle of this, and to question the fairness of someone dying, you being alive. It's okay to be confused about like you got this great gift, but your mental health is still wild, wild most days, and that
Mm-hmm.
you need to talk to a therapist and you need maybe a life coach or a spiritual director. And so I've always worked with students. I've always been a teacher by nature. Both my parents are teachers,
Mm-hmm.
and there's something now that even as a parent, I'm always like kind of poking at people to become self-aware. Like not just I'm having this feeling, but why am I having this feeling? And is it connected to another feeling that I've had before, and maybe something I can work through? And that's where bonus years kind of also shifted into. I really like coaching people. I really want to help people kind of know what's going on inside their body, recognize that they're still a whole person, even though sometimes post transplant, it feels like we have been relegated to parts and pieces. A different team sees a different part of us, and we're the only ones responsible for integrating ourselves and being whole people.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got a tight little community of people right now in my life that challenge me too to say like, oh, you're good at preaching this, but are you doing it for yourself?
Mm.
So I think that's really important.
Yeah, no, I get that part of it. What stood out in your response there is I just had the thread, but it was one thing to write to yourself as a 20-year-old, you have to be grateful, which are not bad things, but then you still have to go through whatever processing, you call it multiple things you go through in order to feel the other side of it. In my case, I remember going through my first transplant, people saying, "Oh, you have a great perspective," and I really hated that forever. And finally, like 10 years later, I think it might have even been after my second transplant, I finally figured out what my great perspective was. But I had to figure it out for myself, and it was like I have a lot more empathy for suffering, especially kind of painful suffering that no one chooses. A lot of times it's health related, but I had way less patience for, you know, things that were not important in life. And that's like that, but it took me 10 years to get there. And someone telling me, forcing like some positivity on top of me was the last thing I needed. So you had like some little mental battle you were going through, it sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Constant.
then constant, yeah, it's ongoing. So then can you maybe roll what you were just sharing then and how you got into, because when I read your title, like it's makes so much sense, kind of like you're singing, like so what you're saying to me, like makes so much sense in terms of pieces, but I know there's sort of stories between them. How did you get from this reflective journal kind of stuff to the blogging, podcasting to coaching? I mean, you kind of give us hints there, but like coaching specifically with a focus on people who've had an organ transplant.
That's the journey. And for me, what I'm learning is things that feel very natural to me don't feel natural when other people hear me say them. So when I talk about the progression of like how I think and how I write and how I, used my body to help me heal because I was a singer, like that was the only motivation I had to stay alive a lot of days when things were really bad. And in recognizing that a lot of transplant centers weren't addressing mental health needs post-transplant, and that community and like in-person support groups weren't helpful to a young demographic of transplant patients, because I ended up going to a support group where everyone was older than me. And they were like, "Oh, you're such an inspiration." And I didn't want to be an inspiration. I didn't want to be resilient. I didn't want to be inspirational. I wanted to be able to go in there and cry if I needed to and say, like, can somebody just tell me it's going to get better? Like, please just give me like a thread of hope that like one day I'll wake up and I'll take my meds and I'll get through the day and like be like, oh yeah, I did have a transplant. But that it's not always going to be the first thing I think about.
Yeah, there's a lot
And
of
because
pressure in that. You're
so
such an
much.
inspiration. There's a lot of pressure in that.
Yeah. And we aren't resilient on purpose. I think we're resilient because of necessity, right? Like, what else are we going to
Yeah.
do? We're doing the next thing we have to do. And so for me, it was like, okay, there's this gap that I see that no one's filling. I want to do that. And it really was that simple for me. It was like, okay, how do I make sure I'm a well-equipped coach, even though I've been an educator and a self-awareness teacher? Like, how can I make sure I'm like providing a good support system outside of like what a therapist would do or a social worker would do, or even family members who are caregivers and love the person, but like they haven't lived it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I landed. And it's been kind of a roller coaster of like certifications, because every time I start learning more, I go, oh, there's more I need to know to
Okay.
be a better coach. So I'm now like becoming a trauma informed practitioner.
So yeah, then maybe build on that. So what certifications have you completed in order to become even better at coaching people through these chronic illness slash recipient stories?
The coach of life and hard knocks would be the first
Okay.
one.
Okay.
Lived
Got number one.
experience. Yeah,
Lived
there's number
experience.
one.
Okay.
Number two, I was a pastor for many, many years.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I gravitated naturally to the people who were in chronic pain, had ongoing things that may never see healing the way we think of healing.
Mm-hmm.
Like how do we live in this space of discomfort? And then I also liked a lot of self-awareness tools. I worked with a lot of young adults in my church experience and tried to help them become emotionally aware and spiritually aware, and maybe not make the same mistakes I made when I was in my 20s, just to
Yeah.
say, like, I know me. So I started a certification through the Enneagram, which is a self-awareness tool. And that was my very first like certification. I started looking at personality and different types and how just our innate wiring of how we process things affects how we heal from
Ooh.
trauma and from chronic
Wow.
illness.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no one really doing that in the Enneagram space. to say like, there's not an end goal. We're still just trying to like figure out how to do the life thing while we're living it. And now I'm doing neurolinguistic programming and trauma awareness, so that I can help people do the body work of reintegrating themselves and saying like, oh, there's part of me that wants this, and there's part of me that wants this, and how do I find out like what the truest part of me is? And then I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I feel like if you've lived a little bit, you might, but where you're like sharing part of your story and your trauma gets re-triggered a little bit, like something you've been through. And I had a therapist say to me one time, like, you don't need to be able to rehash your whole story to heal from it.
Oh.
And I was like, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard, because I was intimidated to go to therapy because I was like, I cannot tell this story again. It's heavy, it's hard. I feel it every single time. But our bodies feel it without us having to rehash it. And I remember thinking, if I'm going to coach people in the chronic illness transplant space, I want them to know that like I am informed about trauma, not just from my lived experience, but I've been taught and I've been practicing how not to re-traumatize them, how to provide a safe space for them to find wholeness the way they want to live their life.
Got it. Yeah, thanks. That's there's a lot there. I mean, I think you're the most reflective person I've talked to. I think it's, the output of that is the coaching and so forth. And so there's a lot to there. And in terms of what you're saying of like reliving your experience, I know that I strategically try not to share my experience most of the time. And I strategically then share, conversely, only when I'm kind of ready to. And oftentimes I share it in a kind of a summary that gives enough, but rarely do I go back in time and go through each step of, some horrible experience. So I certainly understand, having to, how did your therapist say you don't have to tell the whole story to heal from it? Is that what your therapist said?
You don't have to relive the trauma, retell the trauma to heal from it.
Relive the trauma to heal from it. Oh, that's been really fantastic. So maybe you can finish up by telling people a little bit about, so there's 2 organizations, maybe summarize them one more time, how they can find you and the main message for you personally. And then you have these sort of 2 wonderful initiatives you're putting forth in this world.
Well, before I do that, Zach, I just want to say, I think what you just said has so much insight and wisdom to it that I wish we could like maybe convey to new transplant patients that just because people are curious about our story doesn't mean it's their story to know. And that you get to protect and share the pieces you are comfortable with when you are comfortable with them. And I remember feeling at the beginning, like I owe it to all these people to tell them everything that happened so that they can learn from it with me. And now I'm like, no, those are things that I hold space for in myself. And if it's not going to be healthy for me as a person, like that is not a factor in how I help and support other people. So thank you for saying that, because I think that's pretty powerful.
Well, good. I'm glad it helped.
So the Bonus Years podcast is my primary way of talking to other people with chronic illness, particularly transplant patients, but also people who have mental health challenges. I know that I also have those, but maybe don't fall into the transplant space. And so that podcast can be found anywhere you listen to your podcast. You can also find
called
it
The
on my
Bonus Years,
website.
right?
The Bonus Years, yes.
Okay.
And you can find that also on my website at brookegurrad.com.
How do you spell that?
BROOKEGURRAD.com.
Well, that's a nice singing voice you have there. You just applied to that little tagline. So thank you.
Thank
Sweet.
you. And
So if they want to find you and get coaching, they contact you through the website, or is other ways
everything
they
can happen through the website or through Instagram. That's kind of my 2 hangout spots. I'm also a community manager over at Transplant Life. And so I help facilitate conversations on the forum there and share stories and hold space for support in that space.
Great. Well, this is one of the really cool surprise conversations I had, especially the depth of your reflection on the experience, because it's things that I've experienced, but never, I've had my transplants longer than you. actually brought to the surface. And so you actually gave me a lot to work on in my spare time. So I really appreciate taking the time today and talking to us.
I'm so glad that I had the chance, and I just think you're fantastic, Zach. I can't wait to do more stuff collaborating with you and your team.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Brooke.
All right, have a good one.
All right, bye-bye.